this is basically the only way to shoot for event photography. Now, TTL flash photography, of course, is never perfect, and I never use a speed light on my hot shoe. A hot shoe is a connector. I see a lot of people, even though you use flash diffusers and bounce cards and everything in the world, you do whatever the heck you want, but even though I'm placing this in my hot shoe, my number one rule, and it's not a rule, it's just a damn fact, that about the crappiest ugly photography, flash photography, excuse me, is a speed light sitting on top of the hot shoe of your camera. It's just unflattering. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. You just end up with... Now, there's only one exception to that, and that, of course, is using a ring light. So I always use a radio trigger. But really, the most important thing that I could say about flash photography, whether it's event photography or wedding photography, is that, and this is the case for not the actual wedding, but the actual reception afterwards. Obviously, in the chapel, flash photography is not allowed for obvious reasons. Is to shoot all manual in TTL mode. If you need to change for flash compensation or relative reflectance, like say you got a couple against a white wall, obviously the white wall is going to have a high degree of reflectance back into the lens, and shooting TTL flash photography is going to quench the speed light early. So you can actually notice stuff like this. I mean, all you have to do is just dial in some compensation into your camera, but I shoot everything manual. If you're shooting, this is the rule, this is basically what this video is about, is if you're shooting 20 feet or less, and of course nothing's ever perfect, you're shooting 20 feet or less, drop everything into manual. I shoot always at like 1/200 or 1/250th of a second. It doesn't have to be sync speed. 1/200th of a second, that's more than enough to freeze most things for events, corporate, anything that you're actually doing at 20 feet or less. Even action photography. Now, you might have some lag depending on the amount of ambient relative to the amount of flash they're actually introducing to the scene, because all flash photography, and I told people in a prior video that they should repeat this 3 times to themselves, because it's so insanely important. Just repeat to yourself, all flash photography is like a double exposure. All flash photography is like a double exposure. All flash photography really is a double exposure. And by double exposure, of course, we mean you're actually exposing the sensor within that duration of time, whatever the hell it is, to 2 different lighting scenes. Your ambient, whatever the percentage of that is relative to your subject illumination or the illumination of whatever it is you're dropping on that, and of course your flash illumination, or speed light illumination in this case. But I mean, if you're shooting 20 feet or less, just shoot everything in manual. Now, I know a lot of people are like, well, I'm always used to shooting in aperture priority. Why the hell are you worried about that for flash photography? Just shoot TTL. If you need to drop in some compensation, press in your button, dial in some flash compensation. It's the best, easiest way to shoot an event, a wedding event, anything that's 20 feet or less. Like I said, the only thing that you're going to have an issue on, and that's the case of just normal photography as well, is the amount of reflectance of your subject, and of course how much that's filling up of the frame, or the reflectance of your background. I mean, if your background is like a white wall relative to your subject, it's only a few feet away, it's going to reflect back and it's going to quench the speed light a bit too fast, and then of course you're going to have a little bit of underexposure. Everything should be ETTR anyway. Exposed to the right. Exposed to the right is equally applicable in ambient illumination photography as it is in flash photography, but everything in flash photography, of course, is a double exposure unless you're shooting in total frigging darkness, and most people aren't doing that. Some people are. However, it is the case like for macro photography and other things where you're stopped way the hell down, say f/16, f/11, 16. It's a fairly dark room. The only thing you want illuminated is your subject. This is perfectly appropriate, but then of course it all applies to what sort of composition it is you want to make. The entire point of this video is, why do you complicate stuff for yourself? I mean, I've had so many questions recently which actually prompted the creation of this video. I was like, you know, have I made this video before? I mean, this is the only way that I shoot with a speed light at 20 feet or less. You just shoot manual and shoot TTL. I'm actually not a big, and of course studio strobes are not TTL. Now there's some new fancy studio strobes that are TTL, but I mean, all of this stuff is manual. I mean, people are worried about, well, if I'm shooting manual, then I have an issue. No, you're telling that your camera, this is the aperture I want to shoot at, and so you're shooting flash photography indoors for events or wedding receptions or whatever sort of low light, outdoor, whatever sort of flash photography you're doing. It's 20 feet or less. Just stick your camera slash speed light in TTL and shoot manual. Choose the aperture you want. I actually don't suggest, especially if it's going to be like 15 feet or further, because your flash can't compensate for that tight or small of an aperture. You're not shooting above f6 or f8 if they're, say, more than 10 feet away, but that's something that you'll immediately realize. I mean, this is not film photography. You can go outside and experiment. The only thing you have to do is recharge your batteries, and how much is that going to cost you of electricity? Just go out and practice with that. But you should get really, really comfortable. Every photographer should get comfortable shooting your speed light, which in 95% of instances is 20 feet or less anyway. Just put your camera on manual, say 1/200th of a second, depends on what your sync speed is. 1/200th of a second, 1/100th of a second. Everything, too, is not about your shutter speed, because shutter speed in flash photography, specifically if the illumination is 70% or more, in other words, out of the shot, if 70% of the illumination in total is coming from your speed light, then you don't have to worry about blur from your shot. And why is that the case? Because actual exposure is not the shutter speed, but rather the T1 time, or the flash duration of the speed light that you're using, which in most cases, say you're shooting half power. Actually, most instances like 8 feet or less, you're shooting 1/16th, 1/8 power, 1/4 power even, averaging around 1/10,000th of a second. So your shutter speed on your camera, of course, now I wouldn't do this, because in most cases the ambient is sufficient and you would have blur out of your ambient, but it'll still freeze your subject. You keep it above 1/100th of a second, but I mean, your actual shutter speed is the effect of a T1 time or flash pulse duration from your speed light, not the actual shutter speed on your camera. That's something else people fail to realize. They want to crank their shutter speed up there and they think, well, I'm going to miss the action. This is actually one of the biggest things on event photography, where people are moving around like dancing, like someone's on the stage. Of course, in most cases, in nearly all cases actually, you can't do flash photography for events where someone's on the stage. But in any case, some sort of low light action where someone wants to freeze the shot, they're worried. Like, oh, I'm shooting too slow. It's so dark, even my speed light, my camera tells me I should be shooting at like 1/60th. Don't worry about it. The action is stopped not by your shutter speed in your camera, but by the actual T1 time or duration. T1 time is 90% of the output curvature of the pulse duration energy to be completed out of your speed light or studio strobe, for example. Which basically means that's when the pulse is over. And so at 1/10,000th of a second, you've captured everything anyway. I mean, you can shoot this camera, if you're shooting in near total darkness, like an event, where the camera is barely able to make out autofocus on your subject, you can shoot this freaking camera at 1/4 of a second or a half a second with no image stabilization on the lens. Doesn't make any difference, because my actual pulse duration of my speed light is 1/10,000th of a second. So effective shutter speed is, say, 1/10, average is about 1/10,000th. Your effective shutter speed is 1/10,000th of a second, as opposed to, say, 1/4 of a second on the shutter speed of the camera. This is why it's so important to repeat those three phrases to yourself that a lot of people don't get about photography, is that all flash photography is a double exposure, effectively a double exposure. By the double exposure, we are, of course, referring to ambient illumination and flash illumination, or speed light illumination, same thing. Flash, strobe, speed light. What do they call them in Australia again? They call them flash guns. Don't they call them flash guns? And what is it? In England, they call speed light torches, right? Isn't that right? Torch in England? Can I get with my torch, mate? It's a torch. Yeah, that was a torch with Indiana Jones when they like wrap rags around a stick and like pour some gasoline on it. So, what country is it that calls these things torches? What country is it? It's a torch. Hey, mate, got a torch. You usually don't think of torch as like taking 4 AA batteries and, lighting off a xenon tube. At least not here in American English. Like the word torch and speed light don't go together. Somebody calls them torches. I forgot who, though. Someone's going to have to jog my memory on that one. Thank you so much for watching. If you all use videos, always click the link below. Tell me to jump off a cliff. Whatever makes you happy. Whatever makes you happy. And by the way, like I said before, the crappiest illumination in the world is your speed light sitting on the hot shoe of your camera. Crap. Unless, of course, you like angle it up at the ceiling. But if you do that, if your ceiling is blue, then your subjects that you're shooting are going to look like Smurfs. Because the blue light's going to, land on their face. And when you get home, you're like, oh my God, everybody in my images look like Smurfs. It's like, yeah, that's because you pointed your speed light at the ceiling and the ceiling was blue. Yeah. Lesson learned, girlfriend.